This is lecture 5.4 for Psych 440, Performance Appraisal. In this lecture, we're going to be setting up the rest of our discussion in this and the next module about performance appraisal. So we want to start with a good formal definition. And we're going to talk about the different purposes that performance appraisal is used for and why and how those matter. We'll talk about some of the key elements of a good performance appraisal. This is something that we'll build on a little bit later in the module, getting into some of the technical details of how to set up the best kinds of rating systems and who should rate and how to run the appraisal meeting. But these are some foundational big picture things that need to be in place before we start making those logistical decisions. And then finally, we'll talk about some different types of appraisals, some different places we can focus in our appraisal, and talk about the pros and cons of each of those things. For our formal definition, performance appraisal is the measurement of employee performance based on pre-established criteria and communication of this information to the employee. So some of the important things in there, first of all, is that this is based on pre-established criteria. A boss who just happens to kind of casually give employees feedback, hey, I think you should be doing that a little differently, is not necessarily engaging in performance appraisal because they're not using pre-established, well-defined criteria. It's also important to note that communication of the appraisal information is a key piece of the performance appraisal process. There are occasionally times in organizations where an organization might do some kind of performance evaluation and not share that information with the employee, perhaps say in a test validation study or something that was strictly for research purposes. But the vast majority of the time, part of the goal of performance appraisal is giving this feedback to the employee, letting employees know where they stand, how they're doing, and what they could be doing differently. Within organizations, performance appraisals serve a lot of different functions. They might be used to determine who gets a raise and how much of a raise. They might be used to identify candidates for promotion. They should be used to provide feedback about performance. They might be used to determine who needs training or what overall the company most needs to provide better training on. They're very important for making or at least defending decisions to fire employees. If there is a collective bargaining agreement or a contract that requires that employees be fired for cause, and that employee has satisfactory performance appraisals, the organization might find themselves in a very sticky legal situation. So if you're going to say that you let an employee go for performance-related reasons, it's very important to have a performance appraisal that backs that up. And finally, we do use performance appraisal data as a means of understanding what drives performance in organizations. So good performance appraisal data is really incredibly valuable in industrial psychology research. It's very, very useful for validating or establishing the effectiveness of a selection system or a training program. It's useful for lots and lots and lots of things. We can take those things and categorize them into 4 broad purposes. And these purposes don't necessarily all play nicely together. One major purpose of appraisal is for employee development. Say, hey, you're doing well at this, please do more of this. This isn't working and it needs to change. So it can have the goal of just helping employees to be better in their current job, or an organization that takes a long view might use appraisal to help prepare employees for the next steps on the career ladder. You're doing very well in your current position, but if you're looking for a promotion, you might want to change this, you might want to go to training on this, and feed into that long-term development trajectory. Appraisals are also often used for administrative decisions. Many organizations have performance-based pay or merit pay systems where some amount of an employee's compensation is determined based on their performance. So that's going to be very closely linked to their performance appraisal data. Again, identifying candidates for promotion would show up in this category here. We do use, as we talked about on the last slide, We do use appraisal data for research. And the final purpose, this one's probably the least interesting from an industrial psychology standpoint, but it's of critical concern to organizations, is to have legal documentation about performance. If employees must be fired for cause and only for cause, if you're concerned about the possibility of a discrimination suit, having good, well-documented data showing that an employee's performance was satisfactory or not satisfactory is a really important step in protecting yourself as an organization. If you don't have records about performance data, the court is most likely to assume that, well, the employee's performance must have been satisfactory because you didn't tell them otherwise. So there is a certain amount of record-keeping documentation motivation that you hope doesn't become important, but if it should become important, if you are challenged in court about your employment practices, it's really, really important to have evidence that there were appraisals and that those appraisals were well done and were fair to the employees. The challenge in appraisal is that these purposes don't always play nicely together. Sometimes, in fact, they can work against each other. So you've got a question popping up here in just a second. Do you think appraisals tend to be more accurate when they're used for decision-making purposes or for development purposes? All other things being equal, appraisals tend to be inflated, overly positive when they're used for decision-making. They tend to be more accurate and honest about developmental needs when they're used for development purposes. So if you present an appraisal that's intended for development purposes and then you later use that for decision making, employees may feel cheated, they may feel misled, they may end up with lower trust in the process. If you take an appraisal that was used to determine merit raises and then try to use that for development, it's likely to be inaccurate. On the whole, people tend to hesitate to rate people low if they feel like it could have a negative impact on their chances for a raise or a promotion. So we have to be careful when we use appraisals to think about what purpose or purposes do we want the appraisal to cover. We need to be very careful about using the same appraisal information for multiple purposes. So the first critical characteristic of developing a good performance appraisal system is to have a specific purpose in mind. Your purpose should have a strategic fit for the organization. You should want to do something particular with that appraisal, not just having performance appraisals because a company ought to have performance appraisals. If you don't have a specific intended use, it's very hard to get the data that you want, good quality, accurate data. And because people's ratings are shaped by their perceptions of the purpose of the appraisal, you also need to communicate the purpose of these appraisals. If people think that an appraisal might be used to make promotion decisions or compensation decisions, they're going to rate very differently than if they're told that that appraisal is for developmental purposes only and won't impact somebody else's income or career prospects. Good appraisals also need to start from a job analysis. Your textbook talks about this in terms of content validity. Your performance appraisal criteria should cover the whole job and not be contaminated any more than you can help by things that aren't related to the job. As we've been talking about, it's very, very hard to get criteria that are neither contaminated nor deficient, but your performance appraisal system is only as good as the performance criteria you use. So everything that we've been talking about across the last several modules comes together here. We start with a job analysis. We thoughtfully develop our criteria to cover as much of the job as we possibly can, and then we need to link our performance appraisal system directly to those well-developed criteria. Good appraisals also need to be accurate. In the next module, we'll talk a lot about the factors that go into making appraisals more accurate, reducing and minimizing error. They must be practical. If you've been thinking that, as we talk about criteria, wow, you could evaluate people on 75 different things, and as we start talking about accuracy, well, you have to train your raters, you have to develop really good, high-quality rating forms. You could start to imagine that a really thorough, ideal world performance appraisal process could be something that takes a week's worth of work for every employee. That's not going to be practical. So we have to make compromises sometimes. We have to figure out, maybe I can't cover absolutely every aspect of the job. How do I choose the most important ones? How do I keep this manageable and communicate to my managers who have to conduct these appraisals that this is manageable, this is something they reasonably can do and do well. And then finally, we'll talk about this some more over the next couple of modules as well. Good appraisals need to be designed in such a way that employees will react to them positively, that they will believe the feedback, that they will act on the feedback. In many organizations, performance appraisal processes are seen as kind of a joke. Okay, once a year I have to go in and meet with my manager, they tell me all this stuff, and then I'll leave the room and we'll never talk about it again until performance appraisal time next year. That's not an effective performance appraisal situation. And in some organizations, it's worse. Performance appraisals might be viewed as actively unfair or actively unhelpful. So we have kind of a tall order for what constitutes a good and an effective performance appraisal system. One more big picture issue that we need to think about in designing a performance appraisal system, and that's what is it exactly that we're paying attention to. When we think about the purpose of appraisals, those tell us why we're rating and what we want to do with the information. But when we talk about kinds of appraisals or types, that tells us what kinds of information are we putting in? What are we paying attention to? Many organizations use things that we would call trait appraisals that are focused on the person, similar to a worker-oriented job analysis. What are the employee's attributes? Do they have great interpersonal skills? Are they dependable? We would call those trait appraisals, even though they're not necessarily inborn permanent personality traits. They might include some skills, but they're attributes of the person. In contrast, we might have behavioral appraisals, in which we're focused on how frequently we see specific behaviors. So we might have lists of behaviors we want employees to demonstrate. Our performance appraisal might be, well, you pretty consistently do this, but you don't do this very often, and I've never seen you do this. So the focus here is shifted away from the person and onto the behavior. And then the third kind of appraisal we might be concerned with is called an outcome appraisal. Outcome appraisals tend to focus on objective data. For example, working in a call center, you might base all or part of your appraisal on metrics like, this is your average call time, this is how quickly you tend to resolve customer concerns. These are very attractive to organizations because the outcomes tend to be what the organization cares about at higher levels. They also allow for more compensation from one aspect of performance to another. So you might have one call center representative who is very deliberate and painstaking, but who seldom makes mistakes. You might have another one who's very friendly and chatty with customers, but they tend to make a lot more errors. Those two might end up kind of averaging out to a similar average call time. And if average call time is really the thing the organization is concerned about, you might say that those two employees are equally good, even if they got there in different ways. So there's not a single best type of appraisal. They all have limitations, they all have advantages. Just to sort of pull those together for you, the trait approach to appraisal is pretty easy to develop. If you have a good job analysis, if you've identified some KSAOs, you can say, here's a list of the things a person in this role should be good at. Go rate your employees on these things. They tend to be easy for supervisors to use. They're familiar and comfortable. The challenge with the trait appraisal is that it's very hard to give people feedback to say, you really need to be more dependable. your interpersonal skills aren't good. Everybody has a slightly different idea of what those things look like, and there's sort of an implication in the trait approach that this is who you are. And that might come across as, that's hard to change. You need to be a different person to be better here. Different raters may have very different interpretations of the meaning of traits. So one person might say, oh, your interpersonal skills are great, I think you're very friendly. You move to a different supervisor and they say, well, no, I don't like your interpersonal style at all, so I think your interpersonal skills are poor. So it's a little harder to improve performance or to show that really high consistency across raters with the trait approach. The behavior approach overcomes some of those difficulties. It's much easier to give feedback. The behaviors are observable. You did this, you didn't do this. If you want to get better, do more of this. People are a little bit less defensive. It shifts the focus to the behavior. The downside is that behaviorally based performance appraisals take a lot more work to develop. It's hard to write a good list of behavioral statements. You have to train raters a little bit more to observe and watch those behaviors in the same way. And the behavior-based approach tends to sort of assume that all good employees behave in the same way. The performance isn't really compensatory. It's harder to, it doesn't acknowledge that you could have two very different styles that get to the same place. Outcome appraisals are very attractive to organizations because they feel objective, they feel unbiased. We talked about this a little bit in an earlier lecture in this module. Outcome-based appraisals also are really nice for goal setting. It's very easy to sit down and say, well, your average call time is 5 minutes and 30 seconds. I'd like you to see if you can't get that down to under 5 minutes. The employee can work with that, they can track that, they can monitor their own progress and see if they're getting better. The challenge is that, as always with objective measures, they tend to be deficient. They tend to include things that might not be directly within the employee's control. Like, say in our call center, the company just rolled out a really terrible software update that caused all kinds of problems. Well, now everybody's average call time goes down, not because of their performance, but because of a decision made elsewhere in the organization that wasn't a good one. So there's no magic answer here. Trait, behavioral, and outcome-based appraisals all have their uses. Within an organization, though, you want to make that decision thoughtfully and deliberately. If you're really concerned with getting good developmental feedback, you might choose behavioral appraisal. If you're really concerned with practicality and something that's going to be easy for people to implement, that might sway you in favor of the trait approach. You want to make sure, whatever you do, that the way you design your appraisal is consistent with your purpose and your priorities. As we move into the next module, we will start to get into some of the practical details, particularly if we're not using outcome measures or objective measures, we probably need to use some sort of ratings. How can we get those ratings, and how can we make them as accurate as possible?